Hello my friends and welcome back to LPJ Models. In this video we're going to be building the 1/48 scale AT-ST Scout Walker by Bandai. When I had my interview with the Plastic Posse podcast, I mentioned I had this in the stash, and the guys recommended I did it as an AT-ST Raider from the Mandalorian. So, here it is, and let's get on with it. This is my first Bandai kit, and I've got to say the details are very impressive. The instructions with their long fold-out sort of segmented section, they're a bit annoying but they're easy to follow, and everything is clear and well laid out. The kit comes with two types of markings, you get stickers and you get decals. Now I won't be using any of these, but I'm just going to show you what they look like. One cool feature about the sprues is that the sprues are moulded in different colours. Now I know it's probably not a tricky thing to do, but it's impressive. Now, I'm not going to do a full sprues and parts breakdown for this kit because the reviews are everywhere. You can find them on Google, YouTube, forums, anywhere like that. But I just want to reinforce that the parts are really nicely moulded. The plastic is really smooth and there's some really nicely rendered detail on here, which I'm really looking forward to painting. Also included is a really nicely slide moulded front plate. There are no mould seams anywhere, just sprue gates to clean up. If this builds up as good as it looks, I'm going to be very impressed indeed. Okay, let's start building this walker. The construction starts on the chassis, I guess. It's the part which the head sits on. As you can see here, Bandai provides some really large positive locator marks, which makes things line up really well. The inside of these pins were coated liberally with VMS fast setting styrene cement, and the parts were pushed together and they clicked in place perfectly. Over the Christmas period I helped my niece build a Lego camper van, and the experience wasn't very dissimilar to this. One of the things I noticed early on when building this kit is every part, no matter how small, has a positive location. So those hoses I just put on, they have got a tab that goes into a hole to make sure they go in the right place. Okay, that's enough gushing about how good this Bandai kit is. Let's get on with the build. After the centre chassis section was complete, it was time to start working on the legs. Now the legs here have some moving parts, so you've got to be careful where you're applying the glue. But if you follow the instructions carefully, you won't have any problems. To start with, I was having a little trouble getting the feet onto the locator pins, but I realised I was trying to put them on wrong. It's best to start with the back part first, click that in place, and then it all goes together smoothly. Once the lower leg assembly was complete, it was just pushed into the thigh assembly. And this is another area you don't need to glue, so it stays posable. And I like moving parts, so for me that's a big bonus. And with those done, that's pretty much the more in-depth parts of the construction complete. There is the cockpit assembly, but it's only a few flat panels, so I've left that off and you can just see those whilst I'm painting it. So all that construction was the best part of 1 or 2 evenings work, so it wasn't a lot, and I know the painting is going to be a bit more involved. I did, however, dry fit everything together just to see how big and imposing it would look, and it's pretty impressive. Okay, so let's do some painting. The interior was primed with Mr. Surfacer 1500 Black, thinned with Mr. Leveling Thinner. This was thinned at around 60% thinner to 40% Mr. Surfacer. This was sprayed fairly close at around 15 psi. For the interior colour I used MRP Dark Sea Grey. I'm starting to really like MRP colours, they go down so smoothly. They are pretty much a hassle-free spraying experience. And I'm not sponsored or anything, they're just really good. With the interior base coated, it was time to start painting some details. The padded areas were painted with Vallejo green-grey and olive green in a ratio of around 1:1. In the reference pictures I've seen, these are supposed to be dark grey, but I wanted to add a little bit of colour to the interior. But in the end it won't really matter because you don't really see a lot through the holes. When thinning these Vallejo colours, I thin them with about 30% water just to help them flow. They already cover really nicely, so it doesn't make that big a difference. I picked out other small details of the cockpit with various Vallejo colours. When painting an interior like this, whether it's a plane or a sci-fi vehicle, then it's always good to have references on hand. And if there aren't references, then try and think logically what each part might be, and try to paint them to reflect that. I also picked out a few panels with different shades of grey just to add some more tonal variation. Once all the details were painted, I gave the entire cockpit a wash with Abtalung 502 Sepia. This colour is definitely the MVP in my oil arsenal. This was thinned to a very, very thin consistency with VMS Universal Weathering Carrier Light. One of the biggest complaints about Bandai kits that I've heard is that they sometimes react badly to oil thinner. The problem with oil thinners is they're not all created equal. So it's a good idea to go for an artist or a modelling specific oil thinner and stay away from enamel thinners. Luckily, the Universal Weathering Carrier Light is less aggressive than other oil thinners, so I thought it would be safe to use, and luckily I didn't have any problems. Now it's time to glue all of those painted cockpit panels together. The seats did come with some pre-moulded attachment points for the pilots to sit on, but because I wanted the seats flat, I decided to remove them. I didn't do a brilliant job because it was really tight to get in there, but you won't see it in the end anyway. When attaching the roof, there was an area that looked like a gap around the front, but I don't think I'd pushed it down hard enough. Funnily enough, I think this was the trickiest part of the whole build. Now the AT-ST Raider has a few field modifications on it that make it look quite a bit different from the original. There are only some slight superficial changes, but it makes a big difference. These were started by drilling out two 1.5mm holes on the left hand cheek of the Walker's face. I then used some solder wire of the same diameter and bent this into shape. I didn't have any regular wire this thick, and it wouldn't have been quite so easy to bend. These solder pipes were glued in place with VMS black superglue. They were then taped just to make sure they dried in the right place. I fashioned a grill out of 0.3mm brass wire. This was quite tricky to do. I mean, I'm not a great scratch builder, but I think it adds to the Mad Max sort of vibe that this vehicle has. This AT-ST has some extra armour plate attached to the sides of the cockpit. I cut some random shapes out of 0.4mm styrene sheet and used these to build up the armour plates. I was a bit stuck with this as I didn't have any sheet of the right thickness, but luckily Sarah from Staples & Vine came to my rescue and let me pinch some of hers. Now if you're a fan of 3D printing, moulding and casting, massive stugs or Star Wars content, go and check her channel out. Just search for Staples & Vine or click the link in the description. Once the panels had been cut out, I bent them a bit to damage them and then glued them all together. Once I was happy with the layout, they were temporarily fixed in place to the sides of the cockpit with white tack. In the pictures I'd seen, the joints at the top of the legs were protected with tarpaulins. These were made with post-it notes and VMS paper shaper. Because of the shape of these, the process was quite tricky, so it took me a little while to get them into shape. I didn't show the whole process here, but you get the idea. With the main modifications done, it was time to start painting the model properly. Once again, everything was given a layer of Mr. Surfacer 1500 black. Because smooth paint is important, this was sprayed on in overlapping bands. Also, it's best not to spray from too far away. Anything over 5 cm is a bit too much. We're going to be doing a little bit of chipping using chipping fluid on this build, and by a little bit I mean a lot, so we're going to need a chipping base colour. For this I mixed up a dark brown out of MRP Primer Red, Red Brown and Black. I didn't have anything that quite fit the build that I wanted, so I had to mix up my own. This was followed by 2 medium coats of VMS Chipping Medium 3K. When spraying chipping fluids, it's best to build them up in light layers. If you spray them too heavily, they'll bead up and you'll have a bad time. Once this layer of chipping fluid had dried, I mixed up some MRP light grey and some dark sea grey to get the base colour for the AT-ST. This was mixed at around 1:1. This was then built up lightly over the entire assembly. Chipping with lacquers can be a bit trickier than chipping with acrylics. Because lacquer is a stronger paint, it's harder to chip. But the end results mean that you get finer chips and a bit more control. The main things that you need for chipping with lacquers is a bit of elbow grease and a bit more patience. If I showed you the whole process, you'd be bored to tears, so I condensed it a little bit for this segment. Using an interdental brush, I started working warm water into the surface of the model. This is to activate the chipping fluid, lifting the paint off in small chips. With lacquers though, as I said before, this takes a bit more time. As the lacquer layer is less permeable than an acrylic layer, it takes longer for the water to seep through and activate that chipping fluid. But with some patience and effort, you get some really fine, refined, in-scale looking paint chips. Any second now. It's best to do chipping like this in segments, so I did the chassis first and then worked on the upper cockpit assembly. For this section I followed the exact same steps as before. Okay, let's move on to the legs. We've already done the grey, so it's time to add some red, but first we need to add some more chipping fluid. This seems like a long and arduous approach to something you could do with sponges, but I'm trying to move away from sponge chipping and add a bit more realism and refinement to my finishes. Anyway, to get the red for the legs, I mixed up some MRP primer red with some Tamiya red at a ratio of around 1:1. This matched the red in the cutaway drawing I have almost perfectly, so I was happy with the mix. On film it looks a bit more vibrant, and I don't know if that's because of the camera settings or because the paint is still a bit wet. But in person and in the final images it's a lot more muted. Around the toes I kept the layers fairly thin because that's where I wanted the chipping to really show through. What's that? Another layer of chipping fluid? Why not? Before I chipped the red, I needed to paint on the white tribal markings. These were brushed on very carefully with MRP white mixed with clear dope linen version 1. You've got to be careful when brush painting lacquers that you don't disturb the paint underneath, so very light layers was the order of the day. All of this work was then again chipped away with warm water and my interdental brush. With the legs done, it was time to move on and paint the next area of tribal pattern. Because this was on the most visible area of the model, I had to be extra careful here. I'm starting to sound a bit like a stuck record here, but once that was dry, I chipped that away with my incidental brush and warm water. I base coated the side armour plates with various rust tones with my Ushi van der Rosten splatter stencils. These were then given about 3 layers of chipping medium as I wanted them to chip a bit more, and sprayed with various greens and greys. As you can see here, the chipping is a bit more pronounced because I used more chipping fluid. But because these armour panels were like a bashed together field modification, I wanted to show them as a bit more beat up. In the reference images, these were attached to the models with cables, but only thin ones. I threaded some Infinimodel 1/32 aero rigging wire into some pre-drilled holes. The panels were then glued onto the side of the head with Revell Contactor Clear. I should have used something a bit more meaty for this, but it didn't matter too much. Once this had dried, I started threading and tying on all the cables. This was more of a time-consuming job, but the result was well worth it. Once the cables had been wrapped round a few times, they were glued into place with just a dot of black superglue. Once the cables were in place, I snipped off the excess with my sprue cutters. It's time to do a small amount of detail painting. I painted on the kill markings on this armour plate with my Artist Opus 20 Kalinsky Sable. I used Vallejo stencil because it's an off-white and it's not quite as stark as a brilliant white. With these kill markings, each cross is supposed to signify somebody they've stepped on. Gruesome. For the oil weathering, I started with a wash of Abtalung 502 Sepia mixed with VMS Universal Weathering Carrier Light. This was applied straight over the paint with no clear coats. The wash was touched around the edges of the raised details and capillary action did the rest. The wash stage for me is where the model really starts to come to life. It not only emulates built up grime, but it also gives you some artificial shading, making details really pop. Next up, I built some accumulated grime with Ammo Oil Brusher Starship Filth. I didn't use the built-in brush for this because they're, to be honest, a bit rubbish, so I used a fine sable brush. This was painted around areas I wanted to be grimy and then blended in with a soft brush. When blending oils, if you use a soft stippling motion, then you'll get a nice gradual blend. But if you want some streaks, just brush the oils in the direction you want the streaking to go. I didn't pick this colour because it said Starship Filth and I immediately associated it with sci-fi. I tried several different colours on top of a tester of the grey and found this one worked the best. It's got a nice griminess to it without being too warm or too cool. Perfect for going over a light grey like this. I also used this colour to add some artificial shading in the really deep areas of the craft. Sticking with oils, I added some highlights to the red sections using a mix of cadmium red, alizarin crimson and cadmium yellow artist oils. This was mixed into a peachy colour and then brushed on the areas where I wanted the highlights to go. This was then blended in with a stippling motion with a soft brush. I also used the Starship Filth to add some more shading and grime to the head on the model. You'll have to excuse the poor camera work here, I still can't remember to put the focus lock on. Well, at least you can see the end result. I wanted to add some oil streaks to the extra armour panels, so I used some rusty oil colours and blended these in with a brush dampened and thinner. The AT-ST isn't quite ready yet, but the model comes with a small base. And it's just plastic texture, which is a great base to work off, but I wanted to give it a bit more oomph. So for the base I mixed up some stone cast plaster powder with some VMS European Light Earth pigments. To this mix I then added some static grass, some sand, and to make the mix a bit stronger I bound it with some PVA glue before adding a few drops of water. Once this was all mixed up, and doesn't it look delicious by the way, this was slapped liberally all over the base, apart from the areas where the feet were to stand. Once this mix was still wet, I sprinkled on some sand and some asparagus fern pine needles. I then sprinkled over some of my autumn leaf scatter. I cannot remember for the life of me where I got this, but it works really well for autumn scenes. This was then all lightly pressed in with an old paintbrush. This is just to add a bit more texture and to press the loose items into the ground so they stick a bit better. Next up, I added some AK grass clumps. These are self-adhesive, but I used a bit of PVA just to give them a bit more grip. I then added some twigs out of my box of natural stuff. I've still got the footage, but it was pretty unusable, so I left it like this. I then added some more autumn leaf scatter just to bulk out the base a bit more. This was fixed in place with VMS sand and gravel fixer, straight out of the bottle. To add some more depth, the whole base was given a wash of Abtolling 502 sepia. The grass tufts were then sprayed with a dark British World War I green. I can't remember the exact colour, but it was the dregs of a bottle, and I've thrown the bottle away unfortunately. The tips were then highlighted with some MRP dark yellow. For the final part of this build, I need to blend the AT-ST into the base. The feet were dusted with some VMS European Light Earth pigment, the same one I used in the mud mix. The feet were then given some speckling with MIG Splashes Effects Dry Step. These colours should be enough to blend the walker into the base and make it look convincing. Using slow setting VMS styrene cement, I glued the walker onto the base, just so I had some more working time. And because this walker is a tall machine, it must brush up against trees and various other vegetation, so I added some small branches of asparagus fern into the nooks and crannies on the model as if they'd been torn off a branch, and on the top. These were fixed in place with a tiny drop of PVA glue. And that pretty much wraps up my build of the Bandai 148 AT-ST Mandalorian Raider. Before we get to the gallery images, I'd like to give a huge thanks to my patrons. Thank you for supporting my work. I really appreciate it. If you'd like to become a patron, just head over to www.patreon.com/LPJModels. Also, don't forget to hit that like button if you like the video, leave me a comment telling me what you thought, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'd also like to wish everybody a happy and prosperous 2022. I think we've all earned it, don't you? I'd also like to thank everybody who has been supporting me over the last 2 or 3 years whilst I've been running this channel. It means a lot that you guys have been sticking around, so thank you very much. Anyway, I'm James from LPJ Models. Thanks for watching.